questions, and hopefully with the open up to the audience, we'll have a really lively conversation. And with that, I have honors to turn it over to Rav Bigman.
I would first like to tell you about a discussion that occurred in the Google group of Beit Hillel. I'm a member of Beit Hillel. I warned them ahead of time that I may say something from time to time that would embarrass them. Because I explain what Beit Hillel is.
And Ross is saying, you can't hear?
Can't hear, oh, okay. I would like to share with you a discussion that we had in the Google group of Beit Hillel. Can I stand up?
Want to stand there?
I was like a high douche. Okay. I don't know if in American people have heard about Beit Hillel. Beit Hillel was an attempt to create another rabbinic voice in Israel because there's so many voices that seem kind of strange, maybe exotic, and very often very stringent rabbinic voices, and also voices that the attempt to make halakha all-inclusive and to address many issues that are not really halachic issues as if they were halakha. So there's an attempt to try to bring back halakha in a meaningful way. And I'm a member of this group, and in spite of the fact that I'm a member of this group, I find it very difficult to converse with the other people in the group because of differences of methodology that often are at the basis of our opinions, and we never get past the question of what the specific halakha and the specific issue is. We never discuss methodology. And even though I've said many times, we should discuss methodology because the reason that we're having so much trouble communicating is because we have different methodologies. So, and the latest one was, I'll give you a few examples, but I think it is indicative of the halachic process today, that people are not aware of the methodology they work with. By the way, if you look at responsa over history, you will see that very often the writer of the responsa is aware of his own methodology. They sometimes ask themselves, am I doing this, is this the right way of going? Or sometimes they ask one another, or attack one another on a question of methodology. So one of the things that came up recently was the question of a woman reading a Megillah for a woman. This was the question that came up in Beit Hillel. And by the way, Rabbanim includes, the Beit Hillel includes both men and women, Talmidei and Talmidei Chachamim. We didn't get any flack for that at all. In fact, that women are included in the discussion. And for some reason, which I can't explain, maybe times are changing, something, but we didn't get any flack for that at all. But we did get flack for several decisions that were made. We published something about eating at a Chiloni's house, a non-religious Jew's house. What could be eaten in what way was very, very, in my opinion, and in the opinion of Nachum Rabinovich, quite stringent psak halacha. We could have gone much further. And in spite of that, of course, we got flack for it. But the specific discussion that was going on now was about women reading Megillah for women. And they wanted to encourage women to read the Megillah for other women. So I will now just say a few words about Shulchan Aruch. Maybe people are very much aware of this. The simple meaning of the Gemara and most of the Rishonim is that a woman could read Megillah for men as well. And then the Shulchan Aruch says, Yesh Omrim, that she cannot. And then the Rama says, when she reads Megillah for herself, she should say, Lishma Mikra Megillah. The simple way this is understood is that the Yesh Omrim is the position of the Bahag, and the Rama more or less acquiesces to that opinion. And therefore, in Ashkenazi communities, women should not read the Megillah for men. Okay, the Magen Avraham actually mentions the Midrash Ne'elam a Kabbalic source that says that women should not read for women either. But he only mentions that source. The interesting thing about the Magen Avraham, when it says Yesh Omrim, there's those that say that a woman should not read for men. He says this has nothing to do with the Bahag, it has to do with Kvod Tzibur, which would seem to mean that the Magen Avraham actually had a leaning in this issue, which he does in many issues. By the way, one of our teachers, Rav Yossi Slotnik, is writing a paper about the Magen Avraham's lenient approach to women's issues. Okay, so so while they were writing this, they had this question about should we really push women to have a separate reading of the Megillah, woman for women. They were worried about the fact that it would create a situation in which the community was not reading the Megillah together. This was their concern. So a few of us, I would say old-timers, said, well, why don't you mention the Shita of the Beit Yosef? Like Rav Avi Wolfish, we're old-timers, we're a little bit older than most of the people there. And it didn't register. I said, you can mention the Shita, the main, of most of the Rishonim, the Gemara, the Beit Yosef, just mention that that's a possibility. So that didn't pass at all. The next thing that happened was at the end of all this discussion, I said, well, I'm going to try something else. I said, I know of a community in which is true, there's a community in Baltimore where a woman reads the Megillah in the main Beit Knesset, but for those that are concerned about the Shita of the Bahag and Minhag Ashkenaz, there's another reading of a man for those who do not want to fulfill their obligation of the reading of a woman. What would you say to them? And this is the way I phrased it. I said, would you say to them, how you are wrong for following the Beit Yosef? Okay. So then the result, the answer I got from one of the Rabbanim was, I would certainly say to them that they were absolutely wrong, and this is pure, very poor halachic thinking. So I think I finished my lecture. I don't get it. I don't get the אני אסביר את זה בעברית ואתם תעזרו לי. אני לא מבין את הפוזה. I don't get it. I don't understand. There's something about it which is so, I don't know, I'm too tired. I was up at 3:30 in the morning, so now I'm thinking in Hebrew. הם כל כך מכווצים. איך מסבירים את זה באנגלית?
Narrow.
Yeah, they're so hemmed
They
in.
contracted, like everything is so tense. That's a major shita rishonim, the classical psika, when there's a major shita rishonim, let's say this community was in the wrong. But they've been doing it. I was asked by them 10 years after they've been doing it, something like that. They've been doing it for a long time. So the natural thing for a sake to do would be to try to protect the minhag that already existed. So even if you don't want to say, okay, we have the option. By the way, the option of following the Beit Yosef makes a lot of sense in Israel because it's very hard to talk about the present day modern Orthodox community in Israel as being Ashkenazic. Because that was another part. So I actually mentioned that as well while we were going through this discussion. I said, we should discuss the question of whether or not Ashkenazic minhag is really authoritative in our situation. So they said these are the more open-minded people of the rabbinic world in Israel. They said, this is a question for the Gdolim, not for us.
Oh.
So I don't get that either. No, I don't get it for among the other reasons. One of the reasons I don't get it is because we're getting older. There's a certain time in life when you can't, when you're young, rabbi, just starting out, so you approach your elders to ask these questions, but there really is nobody else. We can't approach Rav Amital. Who are we going to approach with these issues? Who are these elders that we were supposed to approach? And who understands the community? So I'll go back. I'll backtrack a little bit and I'll say something about my methodology. The first thing is, as one of the great poskim of the previous generation, whose name was Rav Yosef Masas, who was the chief rabbi of Haifa, said, my first mentor in halachic issues is reality. So first you have to know what the situation at hand is. So since we mentioned, it was mentioned that I deal a lot with questions of halachic infertility, so one of the things I do, which I think that many don't, but it's not only the Rabbanim's fault, I'll get to that in a minute, but I take a good history. I listen to the family that has the problem. Usually the woman calls, and I spend a lot of time on the telephone understanding exactly what her situation is. My father was also a doctor, he passed away 2 months ago. He always said the main thing is to take a good history. So I always am very attentive. But it's not only from my father, it's also from the Haredi poskim that I learned from. That they told me time and time again, you have to be very attentive, otherwise you'll just get it wrong. So the first thing is to be attentive to the situation at hand. The second thing is to try to delineate what possibilities are available, what poskim over the generations have said, and what was most appropriate for the situation. In a rare instance, we then have to use creativity. In other words, if there's a very dire kind of human situation, I don't find a position in the Sikha that is appropriate for that situation, then sometimes creativity is needed. That's when I was young and I had a creative idea. I would call one of the elders and say, do you think this is a good idea? And sometimes, rarely, usually they said they thought it was, and sometimes they said you're just completely wrong. Like they didn't accept it at all. So one of the things I find is that in order to do this properly, you must go back to primary source and learn the sugya itself and see what the major issues are, and only then go on to later psika. And that's another thing that I find in the Beit Hillel group, which I think is very indicative, because these are people that want to be attentive to the needs of modern orthodoxy in Israel. They're not only Tzionei Dati, they claim to be modern Orthodox. And the thing that's most prevalent in the discussions is to just quote Achronim. They quote the latest authorities without ever getting to the real going back to the primary source. That's what the problem with this question about the Beit Yosef was, because they never really bothered going back to the primary source material. And the other thing is an awful lot of what I would call policy decisions that are couched in halachic terms. They have a patronizing kind of approach towards the person asking the question. In other words, even though something is certainly mutar, they won't necessarily say it's mutar because they think of other ramifications relating to the society that it's asking the questions, and they assume they know what's best. So it's not, which is legitimate from the halachic point of view, but it's not always appropriate in a society where the people are learned and can really get it on their own. And then I kind of think, well, what does it say about the respect you have for your community and their? I'm thinking it. I'm so tired. I apologize. I'm so tired. I'm slipping. Even though English is my native tongue, but I slip into Hebrew. זה לא מכבד את הקהילה ואת שיקול הדעת שלהם. So.
They're not honoring the congregation and their ability to reason, their maturity,
Judgment. So one of the things that happened. So here's I was asked a few years ago by a school about what they used for many years, had the girls singing at the ceremonies of Yom HaShoah and Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaAtzmaut. They had solo singers. So I was asked by the school, not as an official capacity, because there was a school rabbi, actually he asked me what I thought about it. So I wrote a tshuva, and in my tshuva, I talked about the different opinions of the Rishonim, and I decided that even though there was you could go to a very lenient way, which was just to say whatever we're used to, we're used to. I decided not to go that way because of because of a policy issue. But I want to show you how I think I did respect the community, but I'm not so sure because I decided, I put all the materials that I could in the tshuva, but I decided that it would be a better policy would be that Kol Bisha was relevant because I thought certain kinds of singing that were in vogue in Western society were not appropriate for us or our schools. And I thought, and there's much basis for that in the Rishonim and Achronim, that the type of singing that would be forbidden would be singing that was lewd singing, that had like erotic connotations. So rather than saying just whatever we're used to, I decided that was the proper policy, but I put all the information in the tshuva. And I also noted that according to Sefer Hasidim, that even though it's not halachically, it's phrased in halachic form, that would be appropriate for male singers as well. And I suggested certain kind of criteria. And that even though I did suggest a certain thing which we had was policy, I thought that we should make Kol Bisha Erva relevant and not make it completely irrelevant. And I thought that was, there were more poskim in favor of that opinion. I didn't hide the other information. And I also trusted the community to know which singing would be considered appropriate and which would not. And then most of the flack I got for the tshuva, by the way, first of all, it was very mild, but most of the flack I got for the tshuva was, how can you trust people to decide which singing is appropriate and which isn't? And my response is, I don't trust everybody to do the right thing always. However, I do trust people to make the judgment whether it's right or wrong. In other words, I think people know whether the singing is appropriate or not. They might stay at the event, even though it's inappropriate, but that's not a problem of halakha. That's just because we don't always hold up to our own standards. And Adam Tzaddik B'Aretz, she has said stuff a lot, but I think you can tell the difference, and I trust people's judgment. So that shows you the difference in approach. So I think that the time has come to reinstate three things that I think were once more or less in vogue. The first thing is to be attentive to the needs of the society you're giving the tshuva to their needs and to the situation at hand. The second thing is to do real research from the primary sources through the later poskim and delineate what the possibilities are and to try to decide which is more appropriate for the society at hand. And the third is to present it in a way that people can understand and be involved in the decision-making process and not decide it completely for them. In other words, you can say this, I think, is the right policy, but people should know what was behind it. In fact, actually, after I wrote the tshuva about Kol Bisha, I gave a guest lecture at Yeshivat Koah. I don't know if you know what it's like. It's a kind of a neo-Hasidic kind of place but there are a lot of lamdanim there. So this was like 2 days after the tshuva was published. So I got attacked. I assumed I would get attacked, but the attack was a really strange one. A couple of guys up to me and they said, Bigman, your tshuva has too much candor. You're too open. Because I said at the beginning of the tshuva, I said that I think that women are insulted by this issue, and therefore I think it's tzorch gadol. There's a great need to find a way within halakha to allow women to sing before men. And the tshuva was written in light of that need. And they said, and then I delineated exactly why I made all the decisions I made. So they came up to me and they said, you shouldn't be, I'll say this in Hebrew again, okay, you're too transparent. So I said to them, the people that listen to my tshuvot will not listen unless it's transparent. They need the transparency. They have to understand the decision-making process, and they really have to decide for themselves whether they agree or they don't agree. And I don't think there's any other way of handling it today properly. I think there's something wrong in the idea that the rabbinical figure, we're all only teachers now. I think that all the rabbanim are b'mechilat kvodchem. I think we're all.
Greater honor.
I think we're all really just teachers. We don't. I mean, there's no authority. It's not like the Tumat edition. I already knows that I'm a big chassid of Tumat edition. That the Tumat edition, he could find somebody. He had a situation which was somebody who injured his friend during the Hakafot of Hoshana Rabbah. Actually appears in the Ramad, it appears in Purim, which is more appropriate for us because we don't dance on Hoshana Rabbah in a way that you can injure your friend. But his tshuva, he finds the person. He couldn't actually.
He couldn't hold him legally liable.
He was not legally liable because there weren't any witnesses, but he had the power to find him. We don't have that kind of rabbinical power today. So we're basically teachers. It's the people who are asking us the questions. They will decide whether to follow our jurisdiction or not. So it doesn't make sense for us to be so patronizing towards the people who are asking the questions.
Thank you.
That's it.
Thank you very much. Well, we can start it's a joy to hear so many of the issues that I wrestle with being addressed so transparently. So let's see if we can push. I think the last claim you make is it really is the heart of the issue. There are preliminary issues I would want to go back to. So the last claim, the question is whether there is still such a thing as rabbinic authority over halacha. So it sounds to me like a lot of the disagreements that you have with your colleagues. By the way, advertisements. The head of Beit Hillel will be here in 3 weeks.
Yes, that is very nice.
For the next of these conversations, we can continue it then with Rabbi Newbar. But
Harav Ronen is not responsible for all the things people write in the Google group.
I assume that. So no one is responsible for all of them.
Yeah.
But so it sounds like what you're doing is you're starting on the presumption that really rabbinic authority over halakha is gone. And so now, as opposed to ever being an issue of imposition over authority, really the whole goal of rabbinic halakhic writing is to be persuasive. Which is, I think
So yes.
right. So that, and it sounds. I think that here I confess my own struggle, right? Where I probably am not willing to quite go so far at this stage because it's not clear to me that you can hold a halachic community together in the absence, right? When the only effort is persuasion. I want to connect this to one of your earlier issues,
Okay.
right? Because it seems to, right, this is an issue that I pose to my students often. We live in a world in which we have access to radically more primary source material than any of our predecessors have. Right? At least, right, since the 16th century, basically everyone started from the Beit Yosef, and that was really the options they had. And so there was a consensus developed, which went outside that, right? If you called your Haredi posek, they would tell you, right, you're out of the parsha. We live in a world in which we have access to vastly more information than anyone has ever had. In which, my own experience, there is fundamentally no issue on which, without doing very much research, I can overturn the Beit Yosef on the grounds that there are numerous Rishonim he did not have access to, that I have access to. And so we have a confluence. On the one hand, that if one goes back to primary sources, there's an almost infinite array of options. There's almost no behavior that nowadays that one could not justify on the basis of some argument from a primary source. Nowadays, bowing down to idols is a little bit hard. But short of bowing down to idols, we could talk about what exactly idols are and what exactly bowing is. Right? There's lots of controversy about each of those. Short of that, there's in the realm of ritual behavior, There's very, very little that one can't find, right? That one can't find a medieval or Talmudic or rabbinic source which a reasonably intelligent person cannot use in some way to justify any form of ritual behavior they want. If I were a halachic consultant, somebody, $800 an issue, I'll find you the heter. So we are, so we have the combination of, for the first time in history, almost infinite malleability of the tradition, and at the same time, a position in which rabbis are given almost no authority to reject positions. Right? Where if somebody comes up to me and says, how can you claim that X? But I have a Trumas Hadeshin, or more likely I have a Ritva, I have a Rashba, I have a Meiri, I have all sorts of Rishonim that the Beis Yosef generally do not have access to, right? Whom I can be going according to. So we have, right, so the combination of infinite malleability and absent authority generates anarchy as opposed to community. And the question is whether a halachic community can survive with that combination. So I think people try one of two things. They either try to cut off access to the primary sources so the options aren't infinite, or they try and create some kind of notion of rabbinic authority that goes beyond persuasion, because they know they can't persuade anybody. So I'm wondering how you,
Okay,
do you
so
think that it's hopeless in that sense?
I think you misunderstood me, so I'm happy that you asked the
Okay.
question, because at least when I work, I don't just go back and see what all the options are and that's it. Because I think that there's a tricky part here, which is, just like the Rambam says that the Bavli was accepted, right, and he uses that as the basis for the consensus, even though he also uses it as the basis to argue with the Gonim. He said the Gonim, you weren't accepted, only the Bavli was accepted, right? And then, and Shulchan Aruch was accepted. I think that when we give the halachic decision, we can't just go back to a source that was ignored altogether. But I don't say that in an absolute sense. And there's a difficult problem here, there's a methodological problem, but I think that we have to take into account the accepted opinion of halakha with much more weight. But I wouldn't say in absolute terms. And there was once an argument between Rav Mital and Rav Lichtenstein. I heard, I wasn't there, and you can never tell how much these rumors are really. But what they said made a lot of sense to me. Rav Mital said, they asked him about Rishonim that don't appear in Shulchan Aruch. So, and what is the relationship between that and Shulchan Aruch? So Amital said, Rishonim that are not mentioned in Shulchan Aruch are not relevant. Lo lechuma v'lo lekula. I'm not sure this is true, but let's use these as paradigms. And Rav Lichtenstein said, Shulchan Aruch is just another opinion. Mm-hmm. And I think that somewhere in between. In other words, I don't think that Shulchan Aruch is just another opinion. On the other hand, I don't think it's the final opinion. And that has to do both with, it's both a vertical problem and the horizontal problem. In other words, I don't think that opinions that the Shulchan Aruch did not mention are not relevant, even though I think that the mainstream tradition of Yahadut has more weight, but it also has to do with the fact that sometimes Shulchan Aruch wasn't interpreted in his own meaning. In other words, Yotan Eifshitz says in a few places, I hope he can be quoted even though he was probably Shabtai, but Yotan Eifshitz says that if you have an explanation that fits Shulchan Aruch's language, it doesn't have to be the Mechaber's intent, which reminds us of the argument between Bork and Barak. Aaron Barak and Bork. Do we have to have the idea, the founding fathers' idea, or we just interpret a way that fits the language of Shulchan Aruch? I usually go here also in a very, very, I would say, a very moderate path, which is if I have major Rishonim that thought that this was the right case, the right way of going, and Achronim that interpreted Shulchan Aruch in that vein, I would be willing to go that way, even though it wasn't really the meaning that the Beit Yosef had in mind. So I think that Shulchan Aruch has more weight, and the accepted halakha has more weight than other opinions. but I don't think it's absolute. So it depends on the circumstances. There's extenuating circumstances, then we will be somech on the shita that was. I can give you an example. Immediately, I had a question of spaying a dog. Okay, there are three approaches of the Rishonim. One, and they have to do with the question of not only of whether it's Doraita or D'Rabbanan, but what is really the issue of the spaying. It would appear that the Rambam thought that it had. Some Rishonim think it has to do with a right of animals to procreate. Some Rishonim think that it has to do with that that the comparable law in terms of male animals has to do with aesthetics. We can get into that. It seems like a very interesting, complicated kind of point of view. But some Rishonim think that it has to do with Tzar Balei Chayim, in which case we could be very lenient today. It doesn't seem like Shulchan Aruch thought that, but the Taz explains it that way. So if these are extenuating circumstances, and the question I was asked had to do with extenuating circumstances, I would accept the Taz's explanation of Shulchan Aruch because it's the Shita the Balei Tosfot. It makes a lot of sense in the Sugiyah. The Sugiyah is very difficult. Actually, no Shita really fits the Sugiyah very well, but that approach of the Balei Tosfot fits the best of the different Shitot of the Rishonim. So I would go that way, even though I was sure that the Beit Yosef was just really quoting the Rambam. Under extenuating circumstances. Extenuating circumstances might be ecological issues as well, but it happened to do with a family that had some problems. So there were extenuating circumstances.
So I want to try and push it, because I don't think that I was saying that you held that methodology.
Yeah.
And we might have an interesting conversation. Like I think that there's personally, this is my masorah, right? That there's a big difference between Rishonim that the Beit Yosef chose not to quote,
Yes,
and Rishonim that the Beit
they
Yosef
didn't even know about
didn't
it.
have the option of quoting.
Yes,
Right? Because
I agree with you.
Right, one I would agree with Ramital if he chose not to quote it, and the other would be the Mishnah and makes the Psak of the Shulchan Aruch nugatory in many ways. But that's not the question I have is, but you have students, and there are other people out there who don't share your methodology in this regard. Right, who think that, right, because we're students we share,
Yeah.
right, who take the position that they are entitled to follow any position among the Rishonim that they can find, especially if that position conforms to what they perceive to be as the moral needs of the community. Now, the only way in which you can critique them then is by imposing your authority methodologically on them, and say that while I think that, right, while I would not, within my framework, I do not seek to impose my reading of the Shulchan Aruch on you, but I will tell you that if you choose to paskin like a shita that the Beit Yosef dismisses, right, then I think that you're wrong. And I'm not sure that once you concede the point that we're all teachers, that it's going to be more effective to say that I have compulsory authority in terms of the methodology of Psak, where honestly I think that there is much more room for legitimate disagreement than about outcomes. I have one other follow-up, Bill, so I want you to answer that one first.
I'm not sure. Let me think about that for a minute. I'm not so
I'm
sure.
going to approach it from another way, though, because I think that you, if I understand Rav Bigman, the role of primary sources, and going back to primary sources, is to really understand.
Exactly. We missed that point, but I'm happy you brought it up. That's what I meant.
Understand the original intent and the intent of the interpreters as well, and how they get it or don't get it, and that's very important. But I don't think that Rav Bigman is at all dismissing the importance of the consensus and the direction of Psak in the Acharona.
No, Rav Bigman is not in any way. What I'm suggesting.
We're talking about you. I mean, but
Right, but my question is, but what happens when there are students, right? We're trying to construct a community. And the question is, the underlying is, can we construct a community without some kind of coercive as opposed to persuasive rabbinic authority over Psak? And my point is that since not all students accept, since there are many educated lay people now, or Rabbanim as the case may be, right, younger Rabbanim, who have a different methodological assumption and don't assume that the drift of the Achronim right? And the contemporary consensus has overbearing force. So how does one hold a community together?
By the way, contemporary consensus is another thing altogether, because
Yeah,
contemporary
it's-
consensus, that one of the things that came up about not through me, but it came up through Yuda Brandes and others, they said, what you view as a consensus, the Achronim are the Achronim that Project Shoot mentions, bring quotes, and the Project Shoot is skewed for political reasons. Because there are certain poskim that for instance, they mentioned, for instance, that Rav Gord Shuvot do not appear in Project
Or
Shoot.
Sed Charav.
Or Sed Harav, right? And therefore, it's skewed in a certain direction from the outset. That's another thing that's very, very interesting. A certain set of poskim are always quoted. Sometimes those poskim are quoted not only because they have, let's say, Haredi leanings, but also because they seem to be more sophisticated. But I think that Rav Uziel, who seems simplistic, is very sophisticated. It's just that he has a very straightforward kind of signon. Right? Also, Rav Mashash, they're very sophisticated. They just have this, even, by the way, the Ben Ish Chai, Rav Palim, who bemet Rav Palim, mamash madhim, he's unbelievable. But he has a signon. What he does, first of all, he makes all of his Ashkenazi counterparts into mincemeat. But he does it in a way which is so nice. You can't even tell. So it's skewed by a lot of things. It's not only skewed because they're Haredi, but also they have a signon which is signon מאוד מפולפל, and they seem to be very intricate and but they're not necessarily as sophisticated as they seem. So that also skews the thing. So I don't like to talk about consensus of contemporary poskim,
Okay.
and not because I'm against them, just because I think it's skewed. In other words,
Whatever consensus you want to have controlling.
yeah.
The problem is that you have a community in which many learned people don't share your perception of the authority of that consensus.
Can I just follow, before we get to that deeper question, can I just ask on this consensus, this is what I wanted to ask him on the here, so I think we easily grant that there's a certain consensus among early Achronim to a certain point. Is there a point that you feel where Achronim do, either they branch into communities that are not even talking to each other culturally, aren't even relevant culturally to each other, or that they're skewed politically, or that this consensus starts to break down, or that the authority of a consensus starts to break down some point in the late 19th century, 20th century? I mean, or is there some place where you start to get suspicious?
Yeah, it's a very complicated issue. For years and years, you might even remember this. I don't know if you remember this, but for years and years, when I started teaching in Midesh Dablot and Netziv the first year, so I had to deal with a lot of questions that I never dealt with before. And they asked me to deal with halachic issues. For instance, can a woman wear slacks? So, all I was at that time was B'chor Yeshiva. But I was asked to teach, I had to teach them. So I went to the material and it became quite clear to me that there was no problem. Right? So for years and years I would say, it's not really a halachic issue. So then my students would say to me, yes, you might be right, but it is the minhag already. It's too late. It's too late. It's too late to make slacks mutar. Because it is now halacha that an Orthodox woman should wear a skirt. And I said, well, it depends on the community. That was my reaction. I said, that depends on the community. Also, I live in Kibbutz Harati, and that is a huge question, because one of the things that happens now is that so-called consensus is formed very quickly. But it's a strange kind of consensus, because it's more like Madison Avenue consensus. It's like Coca-Cola. Somebody writes are you familiar with Shuvot SMS? You know what that is? In Israel, you can.
You text it?
They text message Shuvot. Those Shuvot they don't have any. They don't have to. What's the word? הם לא צריכים לנמק.
It has to be 140 characters or less.
Yeah.
What?
It has to be 140 characters or less.
140 characters or less. Also, there is a mixing of halachic and non-halachic questions. For instance, Rav Aviner was asked the following question: is it proper to dance break dance? And the answer was lo adin. At which point I immediately went back to the black hat yeshiva I learned in Detroit and remembered that the guys at every wedding danced the bunny hop in a line, not me. Everybody else danced the bunny hop. And I was wondering, what is that? And also one guy once at a wedding was dancing upside down on a tray. He would dance with his feet. And he broke the chandeliers. Talk about lo adin. So
It's not refined.
it's not refined, right? They said his answer was it's not refined, but that's not what concerns me. What concerns me is that there was a question. He says, I think the question was phrased in mutar lirkod break dance, and the tshuva was lo adin. So it wasn't that clear. I'm not sure I'm quoting it right, but it wasn't that clear whether it was just advice or a halachic question. By the way, Rav Yuval Shelo has a book which is called Reshut Harabim, and shut is written like shoot, like responsa. Okay, Shelot Tshuvot. And I told the editor that she's doing a disservice to the community because these are not Tshuvot. And everybody's confused of what is halakha and what is, there's a lot of wonderful things there, but they're just nice advice for people asking questions. Yeah, and sort of, I'd say maybe Torani and Lander or something like that. It's not Tshuvot. So it's very confusing to people, and that's why this is another issue. But poskim get involved in things that they shouldn't get involved in, at least not in wearing the head of a posek. I was once asked by a community in Modi'in to give a shiur about Shira Chadashah. They were a new community. They were deciding whether or not to have Shira Chadashah or not. So I went through the material, and I showed that there was room to have Shira Chadashah. And they said, what do you advise? And I said, well, where are the mechitzot? Oh, I'm not getting into trouble now. Where are the mechitzot in the shuls in Modi'in? They said they're all back on the balconies or in back. So I said, is it a service for the community for you to make a Shira Chadashah minyan? You should make a Yedidiyah minyan, where the mechitzah goes down the middle. That will make more impact for more women in the community. So at which point they said, this is the important point of the discussion, which was, so the people that were for Shira Chadashah said, if you think it is mutar to have Shira Chadashah, why are you giving us advice? The other people said, if your advice is that it should not, the people who were against it in the community said, if you're giving us advice that it's more advisable to do something in the style of Yedidiyah with the mechitzah down the middle and not something so radical, why do you say it is mutar? So I said, but you asked me for my advice. I took off my rabbinic hat and I just gave you my advice. They couldn't get it. They couldn't get the fact that I thought that the halakha would allow something, but I didn't really think it was advisable. And when I was saying it wasn't advisable, I wasn't saying it as a posek. I was just saying it as a member of the community. And you asked for my advice, so I tell you, I don't think it's advisable. They couldn't get the difference between. It's all been mixed together. Now, poskim. Poskim have mixed things together. It's not like, in other words, this is a multi-generational problem. I don't think it's a problem. It's legitimate for the posek to say there are different opinions, and even though there is a legitimate opinion, but I think we should go this way, and it's done many times. The problem is that today it's been so there's so much confusion that nobody can recognize anymore what is and what isn't, and when the posek is deciding on halachic policy, and when he's deciding just policy, and when he's saying this is the bottom line, there's no possible way this is mutar or whatever. All three are confused together. There's what the sources say, what I think halachic policy should be, and things that are just policy decisions and nothing to do with halakha. They're all mixed together, and nobody has any idea about anything. And I think that it is destructive to the process. People have no idea anymore about and very often things that, because so many things are said in the name of halakha. I'll give you a typical. This is a different student with a different problem. A guy will come to me and say, I don't identify with halakha. A young student, 18-year-old. I don't know what are your problems? Okay, so he lists 10 problems. Okay, so the first three I say, well, they're not halakha at all. They're just something that people are saying, but it's not halakha at all. The other three are, they accepted halakha, but there's another way of going, right? and the last three are accepted chumrot, but the mainstream halacha is not like that. The 10th one is negia. That's the way it is. We're talking about 18-year-olds. So that's the way it goes. Like everything, when everything gets boiled down, it's the only issue that there is a real issue. But there's so much confusion out there. It's not one discussion. It's like happens time and time again. Oh, by the way, 3 of the things are things that his parents do at home, and everybody is telling them that it's wrong, and it's not. It's just a different opinion. That's all. I'm not talking about things like, once Be'er Bar Ilan told me that his mother would heat up the soup on the blech on Shabbat. So he was learning at Merkaz Harav, and he went to Micha Bar Ilan, excuse me. So he went to Rav Herzog. Rav Herzog had a connection with the family, famous family. So he said, okay, lo nora, shitat Rambam. That's what he said. You don't tell your mother off when she's doing something which has a basis in the poskim. That's been forgotten altogether, right? But I'm not talking about something like that. I'm talking about things that are much more less pronounced. For instance, here at Chatayani Maskerium, when I was a young rabbi in Malagibo, I drove everybody crazy about using the ovens for milchik inflation. Because the only opinion that I knew about, lenient opinion, was the opinion of Moshe Feinstein, who says you have to kasher between. Then years later, I was leafing through Shari Mitzuyan and Halacha, which was a Met Sefer Mitzuyan, Shari Mitzuyan and Ilchot Pesach. I found out that there are many Achronim that didn't really think there was a significant difference between our ovens and the previous ovens, and these were obviously poskim that were accepted in America. Because I remember my mother used to do that, and most of these women at Malagibo were Olim from Olot from America. And I was trying to do something different than their mothers did in their own home, which had a clear basis in the poskim, because they didn't really think that our ovens were so different, so small, so sealed, that it became a question of, I don't know if you know the halachic terminology, of steam, of edim. They thought they were very much similar to the previous ovens, and they just thought it was the same old-fashioned halacha, that you could use the oven both for halabi and Bissari. No, the point of this was that there was an existing custom, and because my research wasn't good enough, because I did have the same approach then, I didn't catch on to it, that there wasn't that opinion. I couldn't find any opinion that would make it legitimate, so I said I have to tell them that they're doing something wrong, right? And it was just bad research on my part. But I think whenever you come across something the community is doing, the first thing you have to do is check whether it has a basis or not. That's what we forgot. We enjoy that's the new. The Rabbanim enjoy telling the community, there's a better way of doing this, you're doing it the wrong way. First, let's check whether it has a basis or not. Yes.
So I want to try one more time.
Yeah, okay.
No,
I know, wait, I want to answer your question in a certain way, but it's not a complete answer. I think that the main thing is, and this I found is possible, the main thing is to maintain common language. And that's where I think the problem is. In other words, I'm not so concerned about authority, I'm concerned about halachic thinking and halachic language, and that I think can be a focal point. So far, this may end someday, so far, no matter what I've said, as long as I've used classical language and I couched it in classical halachic terms, when I was convinced that it was a good point of view, I never got, I was never shunned. Like when I wrote Kol Bishayr, I was sure that I would get flack from the poskim. The worst I got was Rabbi Eliezer Melamed saying, I disagree, but it's a very serious tshuva. I got talkbacks from, I didn't see them so much. Except for one family, somebody wrote me, the kids told me, kids of the yeshiva said, you have to see Talkback 61. And 61 it said, my husband would not let me and my daughter sing in a Shabbat meal when there were guests. Because of Kol Bishayr, sings Mirot. Without singing, the Mirot make our Shabbat. And then I saw your tshuva. So I gave it to my husband, and he read the tshuva. Then he passed it on to the Rav of the Kila. Then she said, somebody will have to translate this for me because I don't think it can translate so very well. Vehu boger yeshivot hakav. Does that mean to you? I don't know if that means anything to you, but those are the how do you explain it? She said, it has to do with Israeli society. It's not a matter of translation.
Mainstream.
It's not mainstream.
A centrist?
יש איזה מרכז והר המור.
America's and Haramor, what she meant to say was that he's very rigid, but I don't know if that's the right explanation.
What's the particular strand of the Chardal strand?
It's a certain Chardal, so very anyway, so, and he looked at it, he said, well, I wouldn't depend on Rav Bigman's opinion for Bnei Akiva activities, but if you gives you great sorrow at home, you can depend on his opinion. Todah rabah hitzalta lanu et Shabbat. You saved our Shabbat. Okay? So even this, so I think that if we maintain communication and we use language, we can maintain a certain kind of community that relates to the material at hand. I don't know how far that can go because maybe the people you're talking about have broken the language. I think the language is more important than the behavior. In other words, I can go from community to community and see different kinds of behavior, but if we're all based on halakha, we have common language, we can manage.
So
The problem is that we don't have common language sometimes.
So there are, I guess there's a whole bunch of interesting things to. I think that this idea that comes from David Hartnell of Shalom, right? Among the halakha is a shared.
I don't know.
As a shared spiritual language, it's a very powerful.
I was friendly with him, but I don't think I read that anywhere that he wrote.
It's a very powerful article. Halakha is a shared spiritual language.
Oh, okay.
One of his
I'll read
most
it
important.
sometime.
But in the
Because
way
everybody knows he passed away a few days ago.
yeah. So the way that you're presenting it, your concern is that you will no longer be in community with those who have a different halachic methodology, but whose behavior you automatically recognize as being part of the system. You just disagree with it, right? The Rabbanei Hakav, right? Which you don't. But the question I'm asking is more the other way around. So I think the Shira Chadasha example, which I have, I think to my way, it's a chastening experience for me in my own experience paskening such issues. So you walk in and you say that there is a halachic argument to permit it, which I think Rav Henkin wrote, so it's not a chidush. And then you made a decision that you would tell them that you were only giving them advice, as opposed to telling them that that it was asur for them to do it. And their reaction, right?
They asked me, what do you think about it?
That's
after.
right. So the reaction of those who wanted to do it was that they would not recognize, they weren't interested really in your advice because they knew what they wanted to do anyway. And by the same notion, I suspect, if you had said it was asur, they would have said, okay, so you say it's asur. If you had decided it was halachic policy, so you say it's asur, we don't care because Rav Mendel Shapiro said it's okay. Right?
Maybe, I don't know. I was originally invited to give a lesson, not to give a shiur.
Right. So my question is, that to me, that like the Shira Chadasha community is precisely where the boundaries are drawn, because you have a group of to some degree genuinely educated lay people, to a larger degree lay people who are capable of reading a tshuva in English and deciding on their own that the argumentation as it appears to them is plausible. And it sounds to me like what you're saying. Now here, right, this is where I'm pushing, right?
Okay,
Are you saying?
Push. It's okay.
Right, are you saying?
This is a baby Josh.
Okay.
You can.
I have to say,
Worst comes to worst, I'll start yelling. It's okay. My community gets it every day. I get it from the guys in the shiur klali. I can't get a word out. Everybody's yelling at me.
It's good for our ratings.
Yeah, okay.
We can get into. So it seems to me there are two possibilities. Either you say in hachinami, they have their opinion, I have my opinion. I think I'm a bigger Talmud Chacham than they are. Perhaps you think that, but they have a right to make their decision. And really, people get to do their own decisions, even on issues that are, right, make their own minds, even on issues that have that have tremendous public policy ramifications. So that's one, right? That's one option. The other option is to say no. I think that at some point there has to be some notion of authority, and I might choose to say, right, and I'm not interested in giving my halachic opinion to you, if you're only interested in confirmation. Right? If you wouldn't be interested, right? If you're going to do what you're going to do anyway, you're just looking to me to validate it. So you can have one more person that when the next person comes in and says it's asur, you can say, no, Rav Bigman said it was mutar. Right? So the question is, can you hold the community together? Because this issue will go further, right? You know, Yashira Chadasha is a mild issue.
I wrote an article about a model, a rabbinic model for that could solve the problem. I would like to address some in an anecdotal way, but I'll do that afterwards. I'll discuss things the way I've been approaching certain issues. But I wrote an article in which I just suggested, I don't want to make this practical suggestion here, but I suggested that in a community where there were quite a few learned laymen and the community at large was intelligent, that I would suggest making the halachic decisions as a group decision, in which the Rav would be the moderator of the discussion, with two options. One option is we would all discuss and everybody would vent their opinion, and in the end it would be the Rav's decision, but he would have everybody participated. And the other way would be to have it democratic, completely democratic, okay? Except for maybe a veto, you know, like maybe the Rav could say they would have the possibility of saying no. Okay, the advantage of, wow, going too far, huh? I wrote it, it's written out, you can see the article, it's in the book about
How does the rabbi, why do people listen to the video?
No, it would be a community decision from how to set it up in the first place.
So
You could delineate in some, the idea of it in these different models, you could think of different options. The idea was to gain identification of the community with the process. In other words, I thought if the community is involved in the process, even if the final decision would be the Ras, but he would include the people in the discussion, the source material, and as shikulim, in the end they would accept, even if they thought it would go a different way. If this was the accepted process, they would accept his decision. But then it wouldn't just be some kind of arbitrary thing that is just authoritative. They would have identification. It would also make halacha, once the halachic discussion, relevant to the community. So that it wouldn't just be